The moment my son-in-law slammed his fist on my dining room table and told me that I was a bitter, selfish old man who deserved to die alone, I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up from my chair. I simply looked at him across the table, looked at the faces of everyone who had gone quiet in that room, and I smiled. Then I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out my phone, and sent a single text message to my brother Gerald. 3 words. Execute the plan. That was 6 hours into what was supposed to be my 68th birthday dinner. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand how we got there. You need to understand what kind of man my son-in-law really was, and how long it took me to finally see it clearly. My daughter Claire was 29 when she married Derek Holloway. She had met him at a conference in Atlanta, and she called me the same night, voice breathless, telling me she had just met someone remarkable. I was happy for her. Claire had always been the serious one, the careful one, the daughter who thought things through before she acted. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's heart, and when her mother passed from cancer 4 years before that phone call, Claire had been the one who held the family together. She made sure her younger brother Marcus got through his last 2 years of college. She handled the estate paperwork without complaint. She grieved quietly and moved forward, and I had never been more proud of anyone in my life. So when Claire told me Derek was remarkable, I believed her. I trusted her judgment. Derek Holloway was 41 years old, divorced once, no children from the first marriage. He was tall, well-dressed, and he had the kind of easy confidence that filled a room. He sold commercial real estate in Atlanta. He drove a leased Porsche. He shook my hand at our first dinner together, looked me in the eye, and said, "Mr. Calloway, your daughter talks about you every single day. I hope you know how much she loves you." I liked him immediately. That was my first mistake. They married 14 months after they met. Small ceremony, just family and close friends, at a vineyard outside Savannah. Claire was radiant. Derek cried at the altar, and I remember thinking that any man who cries at his own wedding cannot be entirely bad. They moved into a house in Buckhead, a nice neighborhood, and for the first 2 years everything seemed fine. The cracks started small. So small I almost missed them. Derek began handling Claire's finances, not unreasonably at first. He was the one who knew more about investments, he said. He had contacts at brokerage firms. He could get her better returns than whatever basic account she had at her regional bank. Claire had always been careful with money, had built up a solid savings over the years, and she was proud of it. But Derek convinced her to consolidate everything into accounts he managed jointly. He said it made sense. He said it was what modern couples did. Then he started talking to me about my finances. I had retired 18 months earlier from 32 years as an electrical engineer. I had a pension, a 401k, that I had been building since I was 35, and a piece of commercial property in Macon that my father had left me when he died. The property was not flashy. It was a small strip mall, fully leased, and it generated about $11,000 a month in rental income. Nothing that would make headlines. But for a 67-year-old man living alone in Savannah, it was my foundation. It was my security. It was the thing I planned to leave to Claire and Marcus when I was gone. Derek began mentioning the property at family dinners, casually at first. That Macon property is probably underperforming for what the market will bear right now. Then, more directly, "Dad, have you thought about refinancing and pulling out equity to reinvest? I know a developer who would pay top dollar." I always changed the subject. I was polite but firm. That property was not for sale, and it was not collateral for anything. I had told him that clearly on 3 separate occasions. What I did not know was that Derek had already started looking into ways around me. I found out by accident, the way you often find out the things that matter most. My accountant, a man named Phil Drescher, who had done my taxes for 19 years, called me on a Tuesday afternoon in September. He sounded careful on the phone. He asked me if I had recently authorized any changes to the property title. I told him I had not. He asked if I had signed any documents related to the Macon property in the past 6 months. I told him absolutely not. There was a pause. Then Phil said, "Robert, I think you need to come to my office. Today, if possible." What Phil had found was a quitclaim deed filed with the Bibb County Recorder's Office in August, 2 months before that phone call. The deed transferred 25% of my Macon property into an LLC. The LLC was registered in Delaware. The signature on the deed was mine, except I had never signed it. I sat in Phil's office for a long time without speaking. Phil set the document on the desk between us and let me look at it. The signature was good. It was not a sloppy forgery. Someone had studied my handwriting carefully, had practiced. The notary stamp appeared legitimate at first glance, though Phil said he had doubts about whether the notary had actually witnessed anything. I looked at that signature for a long time, and I thought about who in my life had ever had access to documents with my signature on them. Who would have had opportunity? Who had motive? The answer came very quickly. I told Phil to say nothing to anyone. I told him I needed a few days. He nodded and said he understood, and then he said something I will never forget. He said, "Robert, whatever you're thinking about doing, do it right. Don't do anything that lets him walk away from this." I thanked him and drove home. That evening, I called my brother Gerald. Gerald was 4 years older than me, 62 at the time, and he had spent 25 years as a special agent with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation before retiring. He knew how these things worked. He knew what kind of evidence mattered and what kind fell apart in court. He knew prosecutors and attorneys and the particular way that financial crimes needed to be documented to survive cross-examination. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How long until you see him next?" I said my birthday was in 11 weeks. Gerald said, "Good. That's plenty of time." Over the next 10 weeks, Gerald and I built a case that I believe would have satisfied any federal prosecutor in the country. We hired a forensic document examiner out of Atlanta, who confirmed within 10 days that the signature on the quitclaim deed was not mine. She produced a 20-page report with comparison overlays and analysis that was, in her words, bulletproof. Gerald contacted the Bibb County District Attorney's Office through a former colleague and established a quiet relationship. We pulled the LLC registration records from Delaware and traced the ownership through 3 layers of shell structure until we found Derek's name as the registered agent. We hired a private investigator who established that the notary whose stamp appeared on the deed had not been present at any signing of any document involving my property. We also looked at what Derek had done with Claire's money. That was the part that made me sick. Not angry. Sick. Because Claire had trusted him completely, and what he had done with that trust was methodical and cold. Over 26 months, he had moved her savings through a series of transfers, each one small enough to avoid triggering automatic bank reviews, into accounts she did not know existed. By the time we found the full picture, he had moved just over $240,000 out of her reach. Her retirement savings, the money she had saved for a house of her own one day. Every dollar of it. I did not tell Claire. I know that sounds wrong. I know you might be thinking, why would you keep that from her? Why wouldn't you tell your own daughter what her husband was doing? I want to explain, because my reasoning mattered to me then, and it still does. Claire was living in that house. Claire had no idea, and if she found out before we were ready, one of 2 things would happen. Either Derek would discover we knew, and he would find ways to protect himself legally before we could act, or Claire would confront him, and I did not know what Derek was capable of when cornered. I chose to protect my daughter by staying silent a little longer, and not a day has passed since that I have not questioned whether that was the right call. My birthday is December 14th. Claire had been planning the dinner for 2 months. It was going to be at my house in Savannah, just family, Claire and Derek, my son Marcus and his wife Diane, my sister Beverly and her husband, Gerald and his wife Patricia, 12 people in total. I had told no one except Gerald what we knew and what was coming. Gerald had spoken with the Chatham County Sheriff's Office. He had provided them with copies of everything we had compiled. 2 detectives had reviewed the forensic document report and the financial tracing and had agreed there was sufficient basis to act. They were going to wait for my call. A deputy district attorney named Whitmore had reviewed the file and told Gerald that the forgery charge alone carried up to 10 years in Georgia. The financial fraud involving Claire's funds had its own separate exposure. The evening of December 14th, I cooked dinner myself, pot roast, the way my wife used to make it, with carrots and potatoes and a Dutch oven full of the kind of smell that fills a house and makes it feel like something good is happening. I set the table with the good china. I poured the wine early. I wanted everything to feel normal, because normal was the one thing I needed Derek to feel. He arrived with Claire at 6:15. He was wearing a blue blazer, and he brought a bottle of Bordeaux, and he shook my hand at the door with both of his, the warm handshake, the one that says, "I think very highly of you." I smiled and thanked him for the wine, and I said it was good to have everyone together. Through the first hour of dinner, everything was fine. Gerald was at my end of the table, and we said very little to each other directly. I watched Derek. He was relaxed. He ate well. He laughed at Marcus's jokes. He refilled glasses without being asked. He was performing the role of wonderful son-in-law with the ease of someone who had no idea that the ground beneath him had been removed. The trouble started when my sister Beverly mentioned the Macon property. She did not mean anything by it. She was talking about how property values in Middle Georgia had been climbing, and she said, "Robert, your father's old strip mall must be worth something real now." It was an innocent comment, but Derek's expression shifted in a way that I caught, and no one else did. Just a fractional tightening around the eyes, a recalibration, and then he said, smoothly, "Beverly, Dad and I have actually been talking about some options for that property." "Haven't we, Dad?" I set down my fork. I looked at him. I said, "We have had conversations about it." "Yes." He smiled. "Dad has been thinking about pulling some equity out. There are some really strong opportunities in the current market, and I've been helping him think through some structures that could work well for him." I said, "Is that right?" He looked at me then, and something in my tone must have registered, because his smile held but the warmth behind it withdrew slightly. He said, "We've had some good discussions." I said, "Derek, have you had a chance to look at the Bibb County property records recently?" The table went quieter than it should have. He said, calmly, "I don't know what you mean." I said, "There was a quit-claim deed filed in August. It transferred an interest in the property into an LLC. The signature on the deed is mine, but I never signed it." I kept my voice level. I kept my hands flat on the table. "I'm wondering if you know anything about that." The room was very still. Claire looked at me, then at Derek. Derek's jaw tightened. His eyes went through something I can only describe as a rapid internal calculation, like a man running through options at high speed, and then he made his choice. He pushed back from the table slightly. He said, "Robert, I don't know where this is coming from, but this is not the time or the place." I said, "It's my birthday dinner at my house. I think the time and place are fine." He stood up then. Not dramatically, not yet. He stood up and straightened his jacket, and he looked at me with an expression that was almost contemptuous, and he said, "I have done nothing but try to help you, and this is what I get. You have never trusted me. You have never respected what Claire and I have built together. And frankly, Robert, the way you hold on to that property like it's the only thing that matters is exactly why you are sitting at the head of a table with no wife and—" Marcus said his name sharply. Derek paused. Then something in him seemed to decide that stopping halfway was worse than finishing, and he looked at me with something I can only describe as contempt, and he said, "You are a bitter, selfish old man, and you deserve to die alone in this house." Claire made a sound that I will not describe because it does not belong in a story about Derek. It belongs to her, and it was private. I looked at my son-in-law for a long moment. Then I reached into my shirt pocket and I took out my phone and I sent my brother Gerald 3 words: "Execute the plan." Gerald looked at his own phone under the table and nodded once without looking at me. I said, "Derek, please sit down." He did not sit down. He said something about leaving, about taking Claire home, about how this family had always been against him. Claire was crying quietly and not saying anything, which told me she was in shock and processing something she could not yet name. I said, "You should know that the Chatham County Sheriff's Office is currently parked outside this house. They have a forensic document analysis report from an accredited examiner in Atlanta confirming that the signature on the August quitclaim deed is a forgery. They have LLC registration records from Delaware, listing you as the registered agent for the entity that received the fraudulent transfer. They also have 18 months of bank records tracing $242,000 moved out of your wife's accounts without her knowledge or consent." The room stopped breathing. Derek's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, none of them ones I had seen him wear before. The social ease, the warmth, the performative confidence, all of it dropped away at once, and what was underneath was smaller and harder, and very frightened. He said, "You're lying." I said, "Gerald." My brother stood up from his end of the table and walked to the front door and opened it. Two detectives in plain clothes came inside. One of them was a woman named Detective Reyes, who had been Gerald's contact from the beginning. She looked at Derek and said his full name and told him he was being detained pending arrest on charges of felony forgery in the first degree and financial fraud. She told him he had the right to remain silent. Derek turned to Claire. I think he was going to say something that would have made things worse. Claire looked at him and said nothing. She was very still, the way she had been when her mother died. That particular stillness she had that meant she was holding herself together through something enormous. She did not reach for his hand. She did not look away from him. He was handcuffed at my front door on December 14th, my 68th birthday, at 9:42 in the evening. After they took him outside, I went to Claire. She was sitting in the same chair, and her hands were flat on the table and her wine glass was untouched. I sat down next to her and I did not say anything right away. I waited for her. Marcus sat on her other side and put his arm around her. Beverly quietly began clearing the dinner plates. Gerald poured himself a small bourbon and stood near the kitchen doorway. After a long time, Claire said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since September." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed you to be safe while we built the case. And because I was not 100% certain until we were. And I did not want to put you through this based on anything less than that." She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying anymore. She said, "The money." I said, "We've traced all of it. Phil is working with the DA's office. There's a recovery process. It won't be fast, but the records are clean and the path is documented." She nodded slowly. Then she put her head on my shoulder the way she had not done since she was a teenager, and I put my arm around her, and we sat there at my dining room table with the birthday dinner half eaten and the good china still out, and I thought about her mother. And I thought about how much Margaret would have hated what Derek put her daughter through. And I thought about how much she would have loved that Claire was sitting here whole and safe instead of finding out alone in that house in Buckhead. I did not say any of that. I just held on to my daughter. Marcus broke the silence by asking if there was any more pot roast, and Beverly laughed. And it was the right thing at the right time, the way only families who have been through grief together can stumble into the right thing. I went into the kitchen and I fixed Marcus a plate. The weeks after that were not simple. Nothing about untangling what Derek had done was simple, or clean, or quick. Claire moved back to Savannah temporarily while the legal proceedings began. She stayed in her old room, and we had dinners together most nights, and some nights she talked and some nights she did not, and I let her lead. She was 34 years old and she was going through something that no one should have to go through, and there was nothing I could do to make it shorter or easier. I could only make sure she knew she was not going through it alone. Derek's attorney entered a not guilty plea, which Gerald had told me to expect. The forensic document examiner testified at the preliminary hearing, and the judge found probable cause on both the forgery and the financial fraud charges. The Delaware LLC was dissolved by court order pending the fraud proceedings. The DA's office filed an additional charge related to the notary fraud. Phil was working with a civil attorney on the asset recovery claim, and the early indications were that most of Claire's money could be traced to accounts that were reachable through the civil process. Derek's family hired a high-priced criminal defense attorney from Atlanta. I am told the attorney reviewed the forensic report and the banking records and had a very direct conversation with his new client about the realistic prospects of trial. 4 months after my birthday dinner, Derek Holloway entered a guilty plea to felony forgery and a reduced charge on the financial fraud. The plea agreement included full restitution to Claire. He received a split sentence of 5 years with 2 to serve, and the remaining 3 on probation with conditions. He was disbarred from holding any fiduciary role or financial power of attorney for a period of 10 years. The Macon property is still mine. The quitclaim deed was voided as part of the criminal proceedings. I had lunch with my tenants last month to reassure them that nothing was changing, and old Mr. Pemberton, who has run a hardware store in that strip mall for 22 years, shook my hand and said he was glad I was still around. I told him I planned to be around for a good while yet. Claire is doing better. Not all the way better, not yet, but better. She started working with a counselor in the spring, which took courage, and she talks about it openly now in a way that I think is good for her. She has started going out with friends again. She laughs at her brother's jokes at dinner. Last week she mentioned, carefully, cautiously, that she had coffee with someone from her office. She said it like she was testing whether the words felt right. I told her I was glad. She looked at me with her mother's eyes and said, "I'm not rushing anything, Dad." I said, "I know. That's exactly right. I have thought a lot about what I would say if someone asked me what I learned from all of it. I am 68 years old and I have buried my wife and raised 2 children and built a career and lost money and made it back and watched people I love go through things that nearly broke them. And I think the thing I would say is this. The most dangerous person is not the one who is openly cruel. The openly cruel person tells you who they are. The most dangerous person is the one who performs warmth so consistently that you mistake the performance for the thing itself. Who shakes your hand with both of his and looks you in the eye and makes you feel seen, and behind that performance is someone calculating how much of your life they can take. The way you protect yourself from that person is not by becoming suspicious of everyone. That is no way to live. The way you protect yourself is by paying attention to the small moments, the fractional expression changes, the casual redirections, the times when a generous offer arrives attached to an unusual condition, the times when something that was supposed to be yours quietly becomes something shared, and then something managed, and then something you are gently encouraged not to ask about too directly. Pay attention to those moments, not with paranoia, but with clear eyes. My father left me that property in Macon because he believed it would take care of me, and he was right. It took care of me in ways he could not have anticipated, because it was the thing that Derek could not resist reaching for, and that reach was the thing that undid everything he had built. Greed leaves a trail. Forensic document examiners can follow it. Patient brothers with 30 years of investigative experience can follow it. Quietly compiled banking records can follow it all the way to a courtroom. On the night of my 68th birthday, after the detectives had taken Derek outside and the house had settled into something closer to quiet, Gerald came and stood beside me in the kitchen doorway. He was holding his bourbon glass loosely and looking at the dining room table where my children were sitting together. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Dad would be proud of how you handled this." I thought about my father. I thought about the strip mall in Macon and the rental checks that had come every month for 40 years, first to him and then to me, steady and reliable and entirely unglamorous. I thought about the way he used to say that the value of a thing was not what it looked like on paper, but what it actually did for you when you needed it. I said, "He always said protect the asset." Gerald smiled. He said, "He meant the property." I looked at Claire and Marcus at the table. I said, "I know what he meant."